Dzień dobry Państwu, nazywam się Mateusz Żurawik, jestem redaktorem Harvard Business Review Polska. Dzisiaj naszym gościem jest profesor Gianpiero Petriglieri, który przybliży nam temat zarządzania we współczesnych organizacjach oraz wyzwania, z jakimi muszą mierzyć się na nieprzewidywalnym rynku. Zapraszam. So, Professor Petriglieri, I'd like to start our conversation with the current leadership crisis. Would you acknowledge such phenomenon and could you briefly tell...
You mean to say how deep in denial am I? Of course I do.
Okay, and could you explain us how it actually affects contemporary organizations and why so many leadership strategies actually do not work very often?
Well, I think the leadership crisis exists and it affects organizations at two levels. At the macro level with what's in front of everyone's eyes, which is a very serious erosion of trust in leaders, in people in senior positions, in business, in politics, and in many institutions. It also affects organizations in much more subtle and everyday ways, which is in the way often people feel somewhat disengaged from their company, from their work, and in the way managers sometimes experience a difficulty, despite their best intentions and some very good idea and some reasonable resources, to get the things done that they would hope to get done, and that very often would benefit others and would benefit customers and would benefit the market. And the reason is because once a climate of mistrust starts settling in, that mistrust becomes pervasive, which means it doesn't just affect the few people that have caused it, but affects it everyone, and it becomes contagious, which means that if my trust has been broken by someone last year, just because you arrived this year and you're a decent person with good intentions and excellent ideas, it's going to be a little harder for me to give you the benefit of the doubt, to give you the faith you need in order to prove to me that you are actually a competent, trustworthy person. So it's it would be reductive to think that the crisis of trust only affects those most flagrant cases in which leaders overtly betray the trust of the people that they're supposed to be serving, either by malevolence or by incompetence. It often affects everyone. Now, how do you see it? You can see it, of course. You know, you read the news as much as I. You can see it in the popular surveys. You can see in how few people say that they can trust leaders to tell them the truth or to have their best interest in mind. But you can also see it in people holding back in their job or vis-a-vis their managers, and therefore it erodes teamwork, it erodes communication, it ultimately erodes collaboration in organizations' everyday work.
Mm-hmm. So, since we got crisis, I believe there is something that brought the crisis up. What was working that stopped working now?
You know, I'm not sure I would even call it a crisis of leadership. I think I would call it a crisis of legitimacy. I've said it before. What has stopped working is that people have very often accepted disparities between them and the people that are supposed to lead them. And they've accepted because they felt that those differences were justified. They were justified by the fact that those leaders were either more capable, more competent, and especially justified if those leaders were making as big or bigger sacrifices than they asked people to make. Today what you see is a large number of people that feel they are being led by others who neither seem to have the ability to do the things that need to be done, nor seem to be making the same sacrifices that they ask people to make. And honestly, if you as a leader ask me to make sacrifices that you don't seem able to make, why should I trust you? Why should I follow you? And what you see is a lot of leaders who have lost legitimacy because of that. You see, why do we, at the core of leadership, there is a sense of shared hope, a sense that you as a leader are embodying and bringing about a future that I would like to live in. And that in that future, we both share in the benefits and we also share the work. Until you have that, people very happily follow. But what you see today is very often is a sense that we might not be able to get to share in the benefits of the future that those supposed leaders will be living in which case you're not technically leading me, you're asking me to work for you, which is a slightly different thing.
So actually the employees don't buy the story the leaders are trying to sell. Is that correct?
Well, they often are not convinced, because of the things that have happened in the last 10 or 20 years, that they will be able to be part of that future and benefit from that future as much as their bosses often do. And what you see, I mean, still today, there's a lot of leaders who are trustworthy and to whose companies people flock. There are many companies that are still incredibly attractive. And the reason why they're attractive is because people feel that joining those companies will guarantee them a better future for themselves and will also give them the opportunity to actually make a better future for other people. I mean, really, that part of leadership hasn't changed. What's changed a lot is how many people, the sense people have that they can have access to leadership. Both being connected to the leaders that they're supposed to follow and also have access to leadership for themselves. And that's, that's a bit of a difference. You asked earlier what broke. And I think whenever you have a crisis of leadership, whenever you have a crisis of trust, what breaks is always the connection. Okay. The sense that, you and I, whether you want to call yourself a leader and I call myself a follower, or I'm a leader and you're a follower, that you and I belong together. Mm-hmm. And that where we are going together. Once we have a sense that we might share the same space, but we don't share the same future, or that you benefit from that future disproportionately from me, at that point the connection breaks. So we are not in the same story. We are in parallel stories. And it's very, very, very hard to follow unless you feel the person who's leading shares your story, unless you feel you belong together.
Could you advise on any way to make this story of leader, or that the leader delivers, more credible to the followers?
Well, first of all, you have to be credible not in telling the story, but in representing that story. What is it that you've done? What is it that you've accomplished? What is it that you've stood for? What is it that you've sacrificed for that story you're trying to invite other people in?
Right.
Second, stop thinking of your story as something that you're selling. In business we use this horrible language of getting buy-in. Start thinking of your story as something you're inviting people in. Why should people want to be in your story? I mean, is it hospitable? What's the benefit of it? What are they going to get out of it? What are they going to be able to do? Does it allow them to benefit personally? Does it allow them to contribute more meaningfully? And most of us actually value the stories that allow us to both have some benefit for ourselves, but also to make a significant contributions. As human beings, nothing inspires us more than the idea that we can create value and capture some of that value. And if the story you're inviting me in allows me to do that, and allows me to help you do that too, that'll be wonderful. If the story you're inviting me in seems to disproportionately benefit you rather than me or the people I care about, then it's going to be a lot harder. But at the core, you can't just tell me a great story. Mm-hmm. You have to also show me that story is one that informs your life and it's one that you've made significant sacrifices for. And of course, the second thing is you have to have the ability to make that story become real. because we can share many beautiful aspirations, and for a short period we can be infatuated by these utopian ideals, but over time, unless things start to happen, I'm going to very slowly become disillusioned. You know, it's not so hard to get people to be enthusiastic about a story that you're deeply passionate about. But to sustain enthusiasm, you also have the competence to make it happen. It's not all bells and whistles, obviously. There also has to be some substance there.
So let us go back to it in a little while, but I'd like to move to a topic that you dedicated a lot of work to recently. I mean, this term of nomadic professionalism. Could you explain how it actually changed the organizations today and what new competences it requires of leaders today?
See, traditionally organizations have been based on the idea of corporate citizenship, which is, we pay a lot of attention to who we select, we bring them in, and if they prove to be good, if they prove to contribute and make a difference, we'll give them opportunities and rewards and whatnot. And we assume, traditionally we assume those people will stay as long as they like, and in fact we want to keep them there. You know, if we try to seek the best and retain them. Now, it turns out that doesn't quite work for a lot of people nowadays. And the reason, we could debate it for a long time. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is it because people have felt betrayal by the disappearing of traditional employment contracts, lifelong careers, and so on and so forth? Is it because people have more opportunities? Who knows? But the fact of the matter is we live in a business world in which external labor markets are very prominent, in which organizations can often acquire talent in the market, and that gives them a lot of flexibility, and they can also sometimes let go of talent, and in which individuals can also move from place to place in search of better opportunities to, again, create and capture value for themselves and for customers and for society. Now, in that scenario, many people no longer think of themselves as corporate citizens. They think of themselves as people who are deeply attached to their work, but not necessarily have as strong an attachment to the organization. Now, many people conclude that means that everyone is an instrumentalist. Everyone just basically treats their companies like a gas station. I'm going to stop here as long as I can get to what I need to then go on my journey. And what I find out is that's not exactly the case. Even at a time when people feel a deeper attachment to their work than to an organization, there are certain organizations that actually are disproportionately attractive and disproportionately interesting. Now, what these organizations offer? They offer something different than the traditional organizations of the past, which offered you a chance to get incredible benefits for your citizenship. They offer you a chance. These organizations offer you a chance to be more portable. Means they make a promise of learning as opposed to a promise of loyalty. They tell you, if you stay here, you might learn more than if you work somewhere else. Now, what's interesting is that basically brings companies closer to educational institutions. And I'm sure you talk to and interview many talented people who have that mentality. What is the organization where I can get the best opportunities? And again, that's not necessarily, very often people look at that mentality and say, that's selfish. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. One is that mentality could be rational in a work environment in which you might very easily be disposable. And second, that mentality can be generous because the opportunity might not necessarily just be opportunities for yourself, but they might be opportunities to use your skills to make a difference. The question then is, how do companies attract these people, and how do they let them go in a way that sustains their loyalty? That that requires changing our mindset towards what traditional talent management is supposed to do and not do.
Okay. So far, it sounds like loyalty is more about calculation than actual attachment to the organization. By attachment, I mean emotional attachment.
Oh, I think people can still be deeply emotionally attached to organizations that allow them to become the person they aspire to become, and they allow them to make the difference they aspire to make, that they allow them to do the work that they feel called to. They very often feel attached to organizations because they help them find out the person they want to become, because they help them find out where they belong and where the people that they can lead, because they help them find out what is the work that they're called to do. You see, and traditionally in talent management, we have catered to a group of people that, in some popular versions of my research, get called the hunters, which is the people that know where they want to go. They don't know whether they can get there, whether they're good enough or whether they're going to get a shot at it. And those people deeply attached to organizations that actually give them the confidence and the capacity to get where they want to go. It turns out there's another group of very talented people that, as I said, aren't quite as, they are just as driven, but not quite as directed.
Mm-hmm.
I call these people the explorers. Now, these people very often are asking themselves, who am I? Where can I be at my best? Where can I make the biggest contributions? Now, these people very often are deeply emotionally attached to organizations that help them answer the questions they have. Now, if you look at some of the most attractive companies, what they do is they actually have a very interesting balance of what makes the hunters excited, which is the ability of getting where they want to go faster and more efficiently, and what gets the explorer excited, which is to get some answers to the fundamental questions about why we work and how can we make a difference. And what these companies do is they often highlight the larger meaning of achieving their targets, and they break down large questions of meaning into actionable steps.
I see. So just to get it straight and just to make sure I'm getting this correctly, I believe that both hunters and explorers are just as important or valuable for organizations?
Just as valuable. Just as valuable. In traditional talent management, we've assumed that unless you have this one direction that you're committed to, and you have a vision of yourself in 10 years in your life and all of that, unless you have all of that, you're a drifter. But for many, many more people today, that's not so simple. And the reason is because we live in a much more pluralistic world. We experiment, we have more opportunities. So it's much harder to have this steadfast stance, this is who I am, this is who I'm not, this is where I belong, this is where I don't. In fact, the explorers are tremendously valuable if you are looking to build and sustain a diverse organizations. Because you asked earlier, why do we have challenges with leadership? Because traditionally we have exercised leadership and developed leadership in contexts which were tremendously homogeneous. Unless you looked and thought and acted a certain ways, it's not that you didn't have a chance to lead. You don't even have a chance to enter the organizations. I mean, for the vast expanse of history, most of our social systems and most of our organizations, let's face it, they were pretty tribal. You were either the right type, or you didn't belong. Obviously things have changed dramatically, and we've had enormous progress and improvements. Now we not only tolerate diversity, and actually we seek it, we know the benefits of it, and yet at the same time, we still cling to a view of leadership which from the olden days, which is the person that is hyper committed to one goal, one story, one culture. Now, if you are that kind of person in a pluralistic organization, what it means is that a subgroup will regard you as a potential savior or as a beacon of all hope. But everyone else will look at you and say, I got nothing in common with you, and I don't even know if you can trust you, because I don't know if you understand me. I don't know if you see me. See, in the monoculture, a leader has to understand one dream and one concern. The dream and the concern that give that culture life. In a diverse, multicultural, pluralistic, volatile, fluid organization, whatever adjectives you want to use, a leader still has to do the same thing. You still have to understand the dream and concerns of the people you're trying to serve. The problem is there's many dreams, there's many concerns. In that scenario, the kind of leaders that we've traditionally celebrated, the lonely hero at the top, is exactly a recipe for disillusionment, disenchantment, and very often over discontent. What you need is exactly the kind of leaders that very often the explorers become, who are connectors, people who are able to relate to more than one story, and very often to find bridges between those stories. One of the big challenges we have in talent development these days is that we need more connectors to create stronger bonds in our organization, and we keep telling people to become more visionaries, more of the traditional types. It's a bit like trying to put petrol in a diesel car, to use a bad metaphor.
So can those two groups of people actually interlace in some way? I mean, can explorers become hunters and the other way back?
I think so, over time. Of course, these are not, like always, these are not steadfast categories. There are times in our life where we're very clear about who we are, where we want to go, and how we might get there. And there are times in our life where we are a little bit more doubtful, where we want to see opportunities, where we're not sure about whether we're this or that, whether we're trying to go here or there. I think it's very hard to be both at the same time for a person. It's not hard for an organization to be a home for both. And in fact, I would argue organizations need both, and they privilege one at their perils. If you think about if an organization only had people that were single-minded and incredibly driven and directed, they might be able to get exceptional alignment and often very fast growth, but that growth will plateau because it'll be very hard, very expensive to break the pattern, to suggest something different. You'll have to basically stage a revolution. If you had an organization where everyone was interested in, looking at different questions and stuff, it'll be very hard to get people excited and aligned, but it'll be very easy to actually gather new ideas, to innovate, to change different things. And now, maybe that's okay for some companies to be just, perfectly efficient machine without much creativity, or, incredibly open and inclusive cultures, but without much direction. But, for most organizations, those extremes don't work. We need a certain degree of cohesion and direction, but we also need to be the ability to question ourselves and to be open to the world. And in fact, very often, what we revere the most are the leaders that are able to do both things, that are able to confidently advocate for a direction, but they are not so lost in that belief that they can question themselves, that they can question others, that they can look at, is it the right thing? Very often we refer to those leaders as wise, because they know what they want, but they also are able to ask themselves, what are the consequences should I be able to get it?
Thank you so much. I think we got it all. Thank you.